Hello, everyone. It's really great to be here today and nice to see all of you. I'm Saba Syed. I'm Head of Business Development, Digitisation Services in the British Library, and I'm here today with my colleague.
Hi everyone, my name's Emma Cass and I'm Business Development Manager at the Library and I'm based at our Yorkshire site at Boston Spa.
So between us, we have several years of experience in digitisation and in managing and supporting customer digitisation projects, from material in the British Library collections or third-party collections and archives. So we wanted to use this opportunity here at the show to pass on some tips and hints of things that we've picked up along the way to help you with any projects that you're thinking about doing.
So is everyone aware that we provide digitisation services? Can I have a show of hands for anyone who's aware we do that? So not that many people. So before we start giving you some tips and hints, we wanted to just give a little flavour of the sort of things that we do at the library. So we have a video here, a quick video which I want to show. Ooh. I think you have to touch it. Oh yeah. So I hope that's given you a taster of the sort of things that we do. We've got a long history of digitising, which isn't surprising really given the extent of our collections. We've got 3 main studios across our 2 sites in Boston Spa and London. We also work with partner organisations and they have studios on our site. So we work with the Qatar Foundation Partnerships, for instance, and they have a digitisation studio in London. The studios have different focuses, and that is explained by the reasons that they started in the first place. So our London studio, for instance, historically is concentrated on digitising the library's heritage material, so manuscripts and other precious material that we have. And in our London studio, we have photographers as well as scanning staff. And our Boston Spa studio, we only have scanning staff, and that's because the material in our Boston Spa site tends to not need the careful handling that our London site material needs. The Boston Spa studio started about 20 years ago, and there are 2 different reasons why the studio in Boston Spa started. The first reason is that we were digitising theses for universities, so we digitised theses to put into our Ethos database. The Ethos database is the UK's database of theses. Also, in 2006, we started digitising publisher backlists. So we've digitised over 1 million pages for our biggest customer, Elsevier. But back in 2006, we were approached initially by the academic publishers, Emerald and Taylor and Francis. Both of these services, so the thesis digitisation and the publisher backlist digitisations, we're still doing to this day, so there's still a demand for these services to this day. We also, at both our sites, so in London and Boston Spa, we have conservation support, so we have conservators who are supporting digitisation, as well as providing conservation support for other areas in the library. So today, both our studios support small and large projects for internal projects that we're running, but also for external customers as well. So customers range from individual researchers to companies, to universities, to museums. So all different types of customers really we have. We provide scanning from microfilm, microfiche, print. We provide 3D photography, lots of different things, multispectral images, and we also do virtual tours for the library because the library has exhibitions as well on the sites.
So that's a bit of an overview of our service in the library. And now on to the topic that we wanted to talk to you about today, which is the things you should think about before you start digitizing. There's a number of questions that you should be asking yourself before you get started, and we wanted to share with you what we feel are the most important questions. So, why digitize? That's the first question you should ask yourself. It's important to be really clear about this, because all the decisions that you make from now on are going to come back to your initial reason for why you're digitizing. And if you haven't really nailed that down now, then you might come across issues that are unresolvable further on down the line. So some of the reasons why people digitize, you might want to preserve material and provide access to digital surrogates rather than the physical material. You might want to reach a wider audience than people who physically come onto your site. To support further research, there's loads of amazing and interesting things that people are doing with digital images, extracting the information from them, manipulating them, doing different things. Just enabling reuse or further use of the material, of the content. It's also an opportunity to think about how you could generate some income from your assets. There's also digitization that goes on when you're working in collaboration with another partner. Or you might want to commemorate a date or a particular event and digitize parts of your collection or your archive in time for that. So sometimes it's really easy to pinpoint why you want to digitize. This image here on the slide is a picture from an 1890 edition of Alice in Wonderland. It's called The Nursery Alice. And this was digitized in 2015 to celebrate 150 years since the publication of the first Alice in Wonderland book. So even if you know your reasons, it's really useful to specify that and to kind of put that down so that you can then sort of describe what success looks like for you. So, you might even want to think about it in terms of a mission statement. So, for example, if you know that you want to digitize your collection to preserve the print and direct people to digital assets, you might, can you quantify that? So, quantifying your goals is going to be really helpful for you. So, can you measure footfall and see the difference once you've digitized something? Or there's other measures as well. If you want to look at how many people are accessing your material, so you'll have numbers in your reading rooms, but if you make it available online, you'll be easily able to track how many people are accessing that material. So if you can quantify your goals and set that as your kind of success criteria, then that really gives you good measures to justify your spend at the end of the project, and it might give you justification for further projects or further phases of your project. If you want to commercialize your digital assets, what income levels are you aiming for? Are you aiming to cover the cost of digitization, or do you need to make profit on top of it? So assessing those drivers will support the direction that your project will go, and it will pave the way for how you approach your digitization. So in our view, this is a really key question to ask yourself before you start really looking at getting into the nitty-gritty. And once you know your ultimate goal, then you can start asking more questions and gathering information that's going to help guide your project.
So you've worked out why you want to digitize. The next question is, what are you going to digitize? That it might be set in stone. You might be digitizing a particular item for preservation purposes, for example. And it may be intrinsic to the aims of the project, but sometimes that isn't the case. If you want to digitize multiple items, are the items catalogued? Do you have a list? We would always suggest at the beginning of the project cataloguing the items, because this will then help analyze the actual requirements of the project and also potentially help with timescales and costs. as well as supporting things like file naming at the end of the project. It also means that if items are being moved, and particularly if they're being shipped away from your site, then they can be tracked easily as well. Creating a catalogue will support the work to assess the format of the material. So different types of format potentially need to be digitised in different ways. So as part of the cataloguing and analysing the content, you can work out whether you can do the job in-house or whether you need to go to a third party to do the work. Do you need to acquire new equipment to do the project? Again, you're sort of analysing and working out costs throughout as you're analysing the type of content that you want to digitise. As I mentioned, the format can determine the method of digitisation and also the timescales and costs. So for instance, if you want to digitise a collection of photographs, which are all different sizes and all different items, that's going to take longer than digitising a journal, for instance, or even a book. If you have lots of different types of contents in the scope of your project, so for instance, if you're doing audio-visual material, as well as print material and physical items, you may need to approach different people. So you may want to do some stuff in-house, you may want to go to a third-party vendor, you may need to go to multiple people outside your organisation. The next thing to ask about as well is the material accessible? So at the library, for instance, we hold our microfilm, a lot of our master microfilm off-site with a third party, so we can't get to it immediately. Even the material which is held on our site, the majority of it are in closed stores. So the stuff in closed stores, we can't immediately get to it. It takes a period of time before we can get to it. Material might be part of a stock move, or it may be out of bounds for other reasons. So again, another example at the library, we had a large proportion of our collection which was out of bounds because asbestos was being removed from one of our sites. So we had a 6-month period where we couldn't get to any of this material, and that did affect digitisation of the content. I think it's also really important to be flexible. So if you can add more material to your list of items that you want to digitise, that means that if something isn't accessible, or for instance, it needs to be conserved, so it's going to take longer to be available for digitisation, or if it's part of a stock move and you can't get to it immediately, or sometimes things just can't be digitised. You know, if there's a rights clearance issue, for instance, then if you've got a flexible long list, you can move on to the next item. So it means that digitisation doesn't stop while you're waiting for an item to be ready.
So you've looked at what you want to digitise. The next question is to tackle is, how do you want to digitise? So will you be able to do the work in-house, or will you want to work with an external partner? If you do plan to do the work in-house, do you have the space? Do you have the equipment? Do you have the resource? If you don't have the budget to purchase equipment, do you have the knowledge and expertise in-house to do this? If you want to digitize something that requires specialist expertise, you may need to work with other partners. So like conservation work, for example, or specialist digitization like 3D photography. I mean, 3D photography is quite a complicated process, and it requires post-processing, which not everyone is set up to do. So the image on the slide, it shows actually one of our photographers working on an internal project we have to digitize our globes collection. So we've been doing that slowly in 3D. So yeah, you might need to work with multiple different partners depending on what you want to digitize. Audio-visual is another sort of specialist area. Not everyone is equipped to do that. And other people might specialize in certain types of printed material or manuscript material. So if you're working with a third party, then there's questions you need to ask about how safe and secure is their site. We suggest you make sure that you understand their facilities and the workflow and how where your collection items would be stored, how they would be accessed, how many people would be accessing it, So, and then depending on what condition the material is, does it need conservation work to stabilize it, to make it easier to digitize? So conservation, there's different disciplines for that. You can conserve items for preservation reasons, or you can conserve them to stabilize them for digitization, which is a different discipline. So if you do need to factor in conservation work to make the material as good as it can be for digitization, then you'll need to factor that into your timescales and your budgeting. If the material doesn't need conserving, the fragility or the condition of the material will still impact on the process that you choose for digitization. For example, if you've got something that can't open flat, you might need a V-shaped cradle for the scanner. Or if it's a particularly fragile or tricky item, you might opt to get it photographed rather than scanned. Another consideration is if your material can't be moved off-site and you don't have the in-house expertise, you might want to work with someone who could come to your site and do the photography work. So you need to make sure you've got the space to allow that to happen. If the material is going to be moved off-site, logistics is another area that you need to look at. Do you want to be managing the logistics and the transportation and the packing and the tracking of the material, or do you want to work someone else to take care of that for you? And do you need to acquire specialist insurance if your material is going off-site? Do you want to travel with the items? We've had that before. We've had security traveling with very, very highly valued items, and but that's all a consideration, and it might need to be factored into your costs and your timescales. Finally, the bit to think about is, when can your material be digitized? Do you have a specific deadline that you're working to, or a specific timescale? Is there flexibility around that? Can your scope be adjusted to fit the timings, or the other way around? As Emma was talking about earlier, if you have your catalogue, if you create a larger wish list, then it means that you could be flexible about your timings. There's no getting away from the fact that digitizing is very physical and very manual work. There's no automated shortcuts. You're dealing with heritage. So it's really important to be flexible in your expectations and to revisit these questions throughout your planning stage so that you can kind of flex and plan your schedule accordingly.
So the next thing to consider is, how will your digital assets be accessed, and also storage of them as well. And from my perspective, I think it's a really important thing to think about, because this is actually a really expensive part of any project. And I know sometimes it isn't thought about enough at the beginning of a digitization project. As part of this, the first thing to consider is who will be accessing the content and why. So if you, at the very beginning, have worked out the goals of your project, you've probably already assessed this. So you're probably, you've got all that information to hand. It may be as simple as just finding some server space to store the content on. But if you want to have wider access, either internally within your organization or externally, and there's a preservation element to the digital assets as well, then it becomes far more complicated. You also need to think about the outputs, and actually the outputs of the digitization are really important to think alongside of how you're going to make them available. So, for instance, do you want PDFs? Do you want OCR PDFs so they can be searchable? Do you want the image files as well, which are really important if you want to preserve the content? Do you need any sort of metadata? What sort of metadata do you need for a project? You might not need to worry about access to a great extent if you're preparing a dark archive material, or you're just supplying the images onto a third party, but there'll still be a storage element to the project. Even if the storage is only temporary, you still need to have storage available. And again, this is an added cost, so needs to be thought about. If there's a preservation aspect to the project, or you want to make the content more widely accessible, You may need to speak to a third-party provider to help you produce the best result. So there are lots of different preservation system suppliers out there and hosting providers who provide different solutions. They can provide free access to content or make content available behind a paywall. So if you are commercializing the content, it's something to think about. You will need to think about discovery and searchability. How will somebody get to your content? Will they be searching it via a web browser? In which case, that's when you need to think about things like metadata. Once a user gets to the content, how will they search the content itself? Do they need to, or will they just browse? The example on the slide here is the British Newspaper Archive, which is the library's newspaper database. The library has digitized the library has digitized with its partner a vast amount of newspaper content, but we've worked with the partner, Find My Past, because they have the expertise to make material available. And they also have digitization expertise as well. So it shows how, you should, if you can, work with people, learn from people, and to enable your content to be made available in the best way possible.
So another question to ask is, do you have permission to digitize this content? If you own the rights to the material that you want to digitize, then that's straightforward. However, if you don't, then you need to establish the copyright status. And this can be really complicated because there's multiple potential rights holders, and copyright law itself can be very complicated and is different from country to country. In the UK, for instance, unpublished material produced before 1969 is technically in copyright until 2040. If something is in copyright or likely to be, you need to clear the rights. So how do you go about that? So the library has a team of staff who focus on copyright clearance, and you should factor in this cost to any digitization work that you're going to undertake. If you don't have resource for this, it may be worthwhile to only consider material which is out of copyright, because it is very complicated. For in-copyright material, you could acquire an orphan works license if you can't locate the rights holder. However, this only works for use in the UK and only for set periods of time. So how do you manage usage outside of the UK or for a protracted period? That's a question that you need to figure out the answer to. Another thing to think about is whether you need to develop a notice and take down policy. Finally, for material which is newer than 100 years old, you may need to think about data protection if there's any personal details in the material that you want to digitize. So you should factor in time to talk to the experts in this area.
So the last question, and possibly the most important, so we've left the best to last, is how do you fund the digitization? As we've been talking, we've sort of been explaining the different stages, and actually, everything is expensive, from a resource perspective in particular. You need to think about conservation, potentially rights clearance, storage and hosting, as well as the digitization itself. You may already have the funding in-house, or you may need to bid for the funding in-house, in which case you may need to produce information to support your project so that you can show the people who approve funding that actually it's worthwhile taking it forward. You may need to apply for a grant externally, for instance through the Heritage Lottery Fund or some other provider. Again, you'd need to provide a proposal, so you need to gather all the information that you can so that you can present it to the funding body. And you need to analyse the costs at each stage so they are aware that you've thought everything through and it's a viable project. You may want to reach out to members or to fundraise for the costs, in which case do you need a website? How are you going to get the money into the fund from the potential donors? If you don't actually raise enough money for the project, can you adapt it to change the focus? Again, this is demonstrating that at all stages you need to be flexible, and you need to have a sort of cyclical process so that you're reviewing the project continually as you go through so that you can adjust it. So funding is really important and something that needs to be thought out right at the beginning of the project. So that was a sort of whistle-stop tour through our tips and hints for how to progress a digitisation project. We also wanted to give you a few examples of projects that we've done in the library, just to sort of show the different elements. So the first project is the Jacquier Archive project. This was, for this project, we digitised family papers of the Jacquier family. Now, the papers for this project were held by an ancestor of the people who'd produced the papers, and he was in the UK. The papers were needed by a researcher in Chile who was researching Émile Jacquier, who was a renowned French-Chilean architect. She couldn't come over to the UK to look at the papers because of the pandemic, so she approached us and the person who held the papers in order to digitise them. Now, at that stage, she didn't have any funding for this, so she approached the Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes in Chile, and they were happy to give funding. And as part of the projects, they wanted the digital assets as well, so we would digitise the material, and the researcher had copies of the material, as did the ancestor of Émile Jacquier. And they also have a preservation system, so those digital assets are in the preservation system and will be in there in perpetuity. The other thing we did as part of that project is the papers were in 6 box files, A4 box files, and there was receipts, there was letters, there was all sorts of stuff in there, and we didn't know what to expect until we got it. So one of the things we had to do was go through, so in this was a situation where there wasn't a catalogue and there wasn't a list of content, so we actually prepared that list, and we created a metadata spreadsheet. So we actually put the dates, when we were digitising, we actually drew out the dates of each paper and who had written the letter, and we presented this to the museum as well and the researcher, so that the material could be easily discovered. One thing that made it a bit more complicated was that most of the material was in French, and also dates in the 19th century and 18th century are a little bit different sometimes, so that just added the complications of it all. But you know, it was a really good project to be involved in, and it shows the sort of collaboration and how digitisation can bring people together from around the world and enable access to content. The next project was another one which was material which was scanned, the Backhouse scrapbook. Again, it's a similar sort of project. So this was the Backhouse scrapbook was a scrapbook that was created by James Backhouse. He was a 19th century botanist and Quaker missionary who was based in York. He had created this scrapbook, and it was actually located in New Zealand with one of his ancestors, but the ancestor brought it to the UK to be digitised. And the West Bank Park Heritage Trust, which is a group in York, they wanted to digitise the scrapbook because the West Bank Park in UK, in York, is on the site of where James Backhouse had his plant nursery. So we worked with the Heritage Trust and James Backhouse's ancestor to digitise the scrapbook. And the material was digitised for preservation and research purposes. And the material, as I said, was scanned. But again, there was all sorts of different things in there. So, you know, again, sort of cards, letters, ideas, all sorts of different things. And this was something that had been stored in someone's house. So no one had seen it. It was just one person and his family members were looking at it. And because it's been digitized now, it's much more widely available. And actually, a couple of months ago, a researcher has got in contact because she had heard about the digitization and wanted to access the book and have a look at the material.
We work with a number of small non-profit organisations. So we work with the British Irish Society. So every year there's an award-winning orchid and it has a portrait made of it. So they have this collection of award-winning orchids. So they wanted to digitize them and make that available to their members. So we worked with them. We dealt with the logistics of getting the portraits out of Lindley Library, RHS Lindley Library, where they were stored. And then we photographed them all. And so now they're available for exhibitions and events for the society and available and accessible for their members. and that was funded by the society themselves. So, as Emma's outlined, there's just so many amazing benefits of being able to unlock your own archives and be able to share that by digitizing it. There's more case studies on our website if you wanted to have a look at the kind of range and breadth of projects that we've worked on and people that we've worked with. But other than that, thank you very much for listening, and we're really happy to answer any questions that you have.
Oh, thank you so much, Saba and Emma. I'm going to come over to you if you've got any questions. I hope you take the chance, because it's rare to have experts like this in the room that you can pick their brains. So any questions to get us going? Yes.
Hi, yes, I'd just like to ask, I'm from a very small regimental museum, and we have a lot of books about the history of our regiment. We'd like to scan those books purely for our own research purposes and not to be loaned out in any circumstance. Would that be permitted?
Absolutely. So that's all in the agreement up front, who will have access to those images. If you just want to do it for yourself, we would give you your images on a hard drive or transfer them to you, and then they're yours. So.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Let me come to the front so I can see. Your hand up. We must have, yes.
Hi, I'm David Hughes. I'm with a small company that does CT scanning. Do you use CT scanning at all as part of your archiving and digitization process?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
CT scanning, 3D visualization.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Either micro CT or other types of imaging.
So we do 3D imaging. We have a 3D rig. We're getting more and more orders for that, and that's an exciting area that we're developing. We also have multispectral imaging capability, and that's kind of a blanket term for lots of different processes, so transmitted light, raking light, and that's really exciting as well, because the images then are really enhanced and allow you to see things beyond what's just written on the page. So yeah, yes.
And if anyone wants to come to our stand, then we've got some examples of 3D imaging we've done capturing globes in our collection.
Great, thank you. Yes.
Do you do digitisation of the old 16mm film?
Yes, we can do microfilm, microfiche, glass lantern slides. Yep.
This is turning into a challenge. Can we find something that they don't digitise? Any more questions from any of you? Yes.
Hi, just a question about the advice you were giving on digitisation. When you're talking about setting up metadata, and in respect to collaboration or potential collaboration, would you be able to advise on metadata systems or taxonomies or thesaurus that other organisations are using that you think might be commonly used for the type of material that we want to digitise?
Yeah, as part of the scoping work that we would do with anyone, we can absolutely point you to people to talk to or try and find the information that we can point you to. So yeah, we've got in the library, there's a metadata services department, and around the library there's loads of different experience, so we can absolutely point you to people to talk to.
Hello, anyone else? Any more? Yes.
Hello. Just a really small one. I mean, you might have mentioned it, I might have missed it. When you provided the cataloguing to that project that you were speaking about, did you provide that to them as a CSV, or what format did you provide that catalogue data?
So for the Jekier archive, yeah, it was a spreadsheet, but that was what they wanted, but we can, whatever anyone wants to receive the material in. So we have had We have provided mark records before to customers if that's what they wanted. So again, as Saba says, we work with our metadata services department to formulate whatever format people want metadata in.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes.
Hi. So also kind of a question related to the small archive that you digitised. So I'm coming from a foundation which our collection isn't yet catalogued, but we'd like to catalogue and digitise at the same time, or at least try and kind of piece the two together. Like, what would be your sort of guidance on, obviously, like putting together an initial list, and because it's quite time consuming if it's sort of, 15,000 works compared to sort of just 6 boxes. So yeah, any?
So that's a very common scenario for most people that we talk to. They have a vague idea of what they have, but they don't really know exactly what they have. And so we're really happy to work with you in suggesting a template of how to start with a high level and look at how through the digitization process you can populate that catalogue with more detail. So we would be happy to talk to you about that.
Anyone else? I'm going to jump in with a question because as we work with an awful lot of museums around their digital skills. One of the stumbling blocks, or one of the things I see a lot in people, especially from smaller museums, is feeling very daunted because they think of digitization that they need to digitize everything, and so they don't know where to start. And you talked a little bit about the why, and I just wondered if you could expand on that idea, because I keep telling people just start small, but am I right? How do they do that?
Absolutely. There's a number of examples where people have had a vast collection, and we've suggested starting with a pilot. So you kind of do a first batch as a pilot, which will then inform and help you answer the questions that you need to answer, so that you can then be ready for the rest of your collections. And you can do that in phases and batches, as you raise the funds and find the time to do it. So, yeah.
Brilliant. So it can be a staggered process. And just to get a sense of scale on that pilot, just a number, roughly, how small can it be?
So we were talking to one organisation, and a ballpark figure for their digitization project as a whole was coming in at just under £250,000. So we said, let's start with a pilot. And they said they wanted to spend £5,000 on it. So we did it for £5,000 as a pilot. And now they've gone away to raise funds for the rest of the money. So it can be as small as that.
That's really helpful. Emma, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, we're happy to digitize any amount that anyone wants. I was asked that question on the stand. We will digitize a page if that's what people want, whatever people want, whatever is a requirement, then we're happy to do it, aren't we?
Fantastic, thank you. Just time, any last burning questions? The team, you do have a stand, don't you? So if anyone thinks of something afterwards, great. Okay, so let's thank them again. That was fascinating, both of you.
Thank you very much.
So if you go and have a look around, but if you wanted to come back at 3:15, we're back to storytelling, and we've got a heritage expert, a filmmaker, and a poet.